5 names, quietly erased from official royal records. And the person who reportedly approved it wasn't some palace committee, it was King Charles himself, allegedly signing off on action against his own wife's family. Nobody in royal circles seems to know quite how to say that part out loud yet. Stay with us, because this one has layers. Before we get into what actually happened here, if you're into royal stories that go past the headlines, hit subscribe to Royal Pulse. We track this stuff closely so you don't have to dig through 100 sources yourself. Now let's get into it. Let's start with the woman at the center of this, because understanding her matters more than the list itself. Princess Anne has spent 5 decades building a reputation as the royal who simply does the work. More engagements per year than almost anyone else in the family, for years on end without chasing headlines or building a public brand around it. In 1976, she competed in the Montreal Olympics as an equestrian, the first British royal to do so, and reportedly insisted on qualifying the same way every other athlete did, no shortcuts, no special treatment. That detail isn't just trivia, it tells you how she thinks about earning a place at all. Now hold that thought, because it connects directly to a decision she made decades later about her own children. Peter Phillips and Zara Tindall were never given royal titles. That wasn't an oversight. Sources describe it as a deliberate choice Anne made when they were young, so they'd never draw on the crown as a financial or reputational crutch. Peter built a career in sports management. Zara became an Olympic-level equestrian in her own right. Neither one leans on royal adjacency to justify their public standing. Anne, by most accounts, sees that as one of the more meaningful things she's done, not a reduction in status, but a kind of gift. Keep that value system in mind, because reportedly, in early 2026, Anne applied roughly the same standard to someone else's family, and this time the fallout reached much further than her own household. According to multiple royal watchers and sources who track duchy accounts, patronage lists, and household rosters, the kind of people who notice things long before any statement gets issued, 5 names connected to Camilla's side of the family quietly disappeared from official documentation sometime in early 2026. No press release, no leak to a friendly tabloid. Just an absence where a presence used to be. The most recognizable name on that list is Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, food writer, author, familiar television presence, someone who built a public career that looked independent on the surface, but was, according to observers, always partly supported by proximity to the institution, access to certain rooms, certain invitations that arrived without being chased. That kind of infrastructure doesn't show up on paper, but insiders say it was real and reportedly tied directly to his mother's position as queen consort. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, kept a much lower public profile than her brother, but sources suggest she was no less connected, present at family gatherings, maintaining relationships with palace staff, benefiting from a kind of institutional goodwill that comes with simply being who she is. That goodwill, according to those same sources, appears to have narrower limits now than it did a year ago. Beyond Tom and Laura, 3 additional names tied to the wider Parker Bowles network reportedly lost smaller, quieter appointments, advisory roles, patronages, the kind of soft positions that don't make news when they're granted and barely register when they're taken away, which, if you think about it, is exactly the point. It's far easier to remove someone from a list nobody outside the palace was ever publicly tracking. Here's the detail that should really slow you down, though. Royal rosters don't edit themselves. Somebody proposes a change, somebody with real authority signs off on it. That process doesn't happen by accident, and multiple sources point to Princess Anne as the one who initiated it, with Charles, according to those same sources, giving his approval. A husband allegedly sanctioning the removal of his own wife's children from the institution's official life. That's not a small detail to sit with. So why would Anne, a woman famous for staying in her lane and avoiding the interpersonal drama that has swallowed other royals whole, suddenly involve herself in exactly that kind of family politics? To answer that, we need to go back about 20 years. Charles and Camilla married in April 2005 in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. The late Queen Elizabeth didn't attend the ceremony itself, though she did host a reception afterward, a detail royal historians still point to as a signal of how carefully that period had to be managed. Public opinion at the time was mixed, to put it gently. A large portion of the country still associated Camilla with the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, and the palace's rehabilitation strategy for her image was long, deliberate, and closely watched. Part of that strategy, according to royal historians, involved slowly normalizing Camilla's children within royal spaces. Tom and Laura started appearing at events. Their names began showing up in the right places. Over roughly 2 decades, they went from outsiders to fixtures, never working royals, never on the Buckingham Palace balcony, but present, recognized, embedded in the wider institutional fabric. Building that kind of standing took the better part of 20 years. What apparently happened in early 2026 took a fraction of that time to unwind. And that gap, decades to build, One decision to start dismantling tells you something about how influence actually moves inside the palace. Now here's where the story gets more complicated because the timing lines up with something much bigger happening around the family. Prince Andrew's arrest in February 2026 sent the palace into what multiple sources describe as genuine crisis mode. Suddenly, anything that even resembled unearned royal proximity became a liability worth eliminating before the press found it first. That's the read a lot of commentators reached for immediately. This was simple optics management, clean up in the wake of scandal. But that explanation, while not wrong, doesn't fully hold up. If this were purely a palace communication strategy, you'd expect it to be broader, driven visibly by official channels, applied more evenly across the family. Instead, sources consistently trace this specific move back to one person acting with clear, deliberate intent toward one specific family. Not a committee, not a coordinated PR campaign, Anne. Which raises the real question this story is actually about. Was Anne acting purely on long-held personal principle? Was she responding to pressure from William, who has reportedly been consolidating institutional authority for months? Or was it some mix of both, with the Andrew fallout simply providing the cover and the moment she needed? Let's talk about Charles, because his role here is the part people are struggling to reconcile. He turned 76 in November 2025, marking it quietly, modest by royal standards. He was diagnosed with cancer in February 2024, and while the specific type was never publicly disclosed, treatment reportedly began immediately and has continued since. He's kept working through it quietly without much acknowledgement. That context matters because a king managing his health while thinking about legacy makes different calculations than one operating from certainty. Sources suggest Charles has spent real time reflecting on what his reign will be remembered for, separate from the scandals surrounding it, Andrew chief among them, from Epstein-linked coverage to the widely criticised 2019 BBC interview to the February 2026 arrest. Watching that unfold reportedly sharpened something in him, how much damage one family member's conduct can do to an institution that takes centuries to build and one news cycle to destabilise. So when Anne allegedly brought her proposal to him, sources suggest Charles didn't need much convincing. He may have already privately agreed. And here's the part that sounds harsh but reportedly makes sense to people close to the situation. Charles has always separated the personal from the institutional more cleanly than most expect. His love for Camilla isn't in question, but Tom Parker Bowles is not Camilla, Laura Lopes is not Camilla. Their presence on official rosters, in Charles's reported view, was never really a condition of his marriage. It was something accumulated over 20 years that, in this climate, no longer fit. There's also William. Over the past year, his authority inside the institution has expanded noticeably. Charles reportedly granted William and Kate the ability to issue royal warrants in 2025, a privilege monarchs have historically kept close. William has apparently made his views on unearned royal adjacency fairly clear, a position already applied to conversations around Andrew's household. The Parker Bowles roster, in his reported view, was exactly the kind of loose thread needing to be tied off. So rather than create open conflict between his son and his wife's family, Charles reportedly found a third path. He let Anne carry it. Quiet approval, no personal directive, letting it read as routine housekeeping rather than a husband's unilateral call. Cleaner, more deniable, same outcome. Whether Camilla knew in advance is genuinely unclear. Sources suggest Charles did not tell her ahead of time, though whether that was deliberate or simply a matter of how quickly things moved is hard to say. What does seem consistent across multiple accounts is that when the removals became known inside palace circles, Camilla's reaction suggested she hadn't been prepared for it at all. Publicly composed, as always, but people close to her reportedly noticed the shift. Now let's put a number on what this actually costs her, because 5 names off a list undersells it. Camilla still holds her title, her residence, her staff, her official duties, and by all accounts Charles's continued public support. Position isn't the issue. Influence is, and that's the part that's shifting. For Tom Parker Bowles, what he reportedly loses isn't a title, it's the invisible infrastructure. Faster callbacks, invitations that show up unchased, a quiet assumption in certain rooms that he belongs there. None of it was ever written down, but sources describe it as very real, almost entirely dependent on his mother's standing. When a name quietly drops off the right list, that infrastructure doesn't collapse loudly, it just stops renewing. For Laura Lopes, the impact reads differently, since her adjacency was reportedly more personal than professional. Access to family gatherings, ease of movement through palace spaces, inclusion in the smaller moments that matter enormously in a family like this one. That inclusion, sources suggest, is now considerably less guaranteed. Here's where Camilla's position gets genuinely difficult. The people she'd normally lean on are each complicated right now. Charles remains her most reliable ally, but he's also, according to sources, the one who quietly authorized this. William's relationship with Camilla has always been described as functional rather than warm. He was 15 when his mother died, and that fact reportedly underlies every interaction he's had with his father's second wife. She likely never expected his support here. Harder to sit with is Kate. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has steadily expanded her institutional footprint since her 2024 cancer recovery, and sources describe her functioning less like a supportive spouse and more like an active co-strategist alongside William, including on the Andrew fallout. For Camilla, every step Kate takes toward the center of power is structurally a step redefining where the current Queen Consort stands. Kate isn't a rival, she's arguably a successor. Camilla's more reliable support sits largely outside the palace now. Her sister, Annabel Elliot, reportedly understands institutional exclusion firsthand after being removed from the Duchy of Cornwall payroll when William took it over, but her own reduced standing limits how much she can offer from inside, and Sarah Ferguson's name keeps surfacing here too. Camilla has reportedly maintained that friendship despite pressure to distance herself, pressure that intensified when Ferguson resurfaced in released Epstein-related documents in early 26. William has apparently made his discomfort clear. Camilla hasn't budged. So map it. Charles supportive but compromised, William focused on reform rather than protecting his stepmother's family, Kate ascending, Annabel sidelined, Ferguson a liability she won't drop. A tighter circle than she's had since becoming Queen Consort, and this time, the person who moved against her family did so with her own husband's blessing. Anne's motivation here deserves more than a surface read. This almost certainly wasn't score settling, that's simply not how she operates. It looks instead like Anne applying the same standard she held for her own children decades ago to a situation that had reportedly bothered her for years. Proximity to the crown translating automatically into access regardless of whether it was earned. The timing matters as much as the decision itself. Anne apparently didn't move during the calmer years of Charles's reign. She waited until the environment made this kind of action both necessary and defensible. Andrew's arrest created that environment, public appetite for visible accountability at its highest point in years. Removing names that couldn't be justified on merit, right when the institution needed to demonstrate it was serious about change, fit the moment perfectly. There's a broader legacy question too. Anne is watching the monarchy move through what may be its most significant transition since the abdication crisis. Sources suggest she wants to be aligned with William's direction, smaller, tighter, more accountable, because she reportedly believes it's correct. In that light, the removals read less like an attack on Camilla and more like Anne's own contribution to an institution she's served her entire life. If it cost Camilla's family 2 decades of quiet access, sources suggest Anne has made peace with that. So what happens now? Publicly, almost nothing. Tom Parker Bowles reportedly published a restaurant review the week after the removals became known. Cheerful, ordinary, no indication anything had shifted. No leaks, no pushback through the usual channels. Just silence, which in a family like this is rarely nothing. Inside the palace, reactions apparently split along familiar lines. Staff close to Anne weren't surprised. One source called it vintage Anne, no announcement, decision made and quietly implemented. Those closer to Camilla described something closer to contained fury, less about the removals themselves and more about the manner, no warning, no chance to manage it internally before word spread through royal press circles. Charles and Camilla have shown no visible sign of conflict in public appearances since a joint engagement in early March, a state function shortly after, composed and measured throughout. But composed appearances and a resolved private situation aren't the same thing, and people inside that household reportedly know which one this is. William, notably, hasn't needed to react at all, maybe the most telling detail here. Anne did what needed doing, Charles provided the cover, and William gets the outcome his reform agenda wanted without being the visible hand behind it. That's a skill Charles reportedly spent decades developing, and William appears to have picked it up fast. So where does this leave things? The 5 names aren't coming back. That's not how these rosters tend to work, especially with every remaining name now being quietly re-examined. What happens next depends largely on Camilla. If she accepts the line that's been drawn, the situation likely stabilizes, uncomfortable but contained. If she pushes back through the usual channels, she may force Charles into a choice he's avoided making explicitly, and if he ever has to choose publicly between his wife and his son's vision for the monarchy's future, that's a very different story than the one we're telling today. Anne almost certainly understands that possibility. The real question is whether Camilla ever gives her the chance to find out, and whether 5 names is the beginning of this story or the end of it. We'll be watching closely, and if anything else surfaces, you'll hear it here first.